There are some footballers who people innately feel ought to be more prolific than they actually are or were. Take Didier Drogba for example, who a lot of people are surprised to discover only scored more than 12 goals in 2 out of his 9 seasons in the Premier League. In some cases, such as Xavi and Andres Iniesta, who only scored 85 and 57 goals respectively in the Barcelona first team, I think part of that surprise is the result of a certain degree of misapprehension or misremembering about what their roles on a football pitch really were. In today's video though, I wanted to take a look at a number of current players who I do think really ought to score a fair few more goals. Players like Daniel Podence at Wolves, who is a brilliant little forward or wide man with clever attacking movement, but has next to no composure in front of goal, and has consequently only managed to score 10 goals in 73 games in the West Midlands. An even better example, you could argue, would be Callum Hudson-Odoi, who I think is exceptionally gifted and plays in a very strong Chelsea team, but has only scored 16 goals in 123 games. Even with the caveat that many of those appearances have come off the bench, that is a record that I suspect Hudson-Odoi will be keen to address, and quickly. Then there's someone like Roberto Firmino, who seemed like too much of a cliche for me to even include, but who I thought I'd best mention in the introduction to prevent me from being bombarded with his name down below in the comments. And those are just 3 Premier League players. I had over 30 candidates on my shortlist before receiving plenty more suggestions from all of you wonderful people on Twitter. So I've tried to collate all of them and pick out 7 of the most interesting and outstanding examples of current players who really should score more goals, in my eyes at least. 7th, Gabriel Jesus. Another one that seems obvious, but that I feel quite passionate about, we are sticking in the Premier League for now with Gabriel Jesus. I must admit that I hadn't seen a great deal of Jesus before he signed for Manchester City, but I distinctly remember watching his full Premier League debut for Man City against West Ham in February 2017, and thinking that he was an absolute phenomenon. It reminded me a bit of Sergio Aguero's debut for Manchester City against Swansea all of those years ago, not in terms of how he played, just the impression that it left on me. Jesus scored a goal and grabbed an assist in a man-of-the-match winning debut, but it was more than just those goal contributions. It was about his all-round aura. Aged only 19, he didn't seem remotely daunted about stepping into such a brilliant team in a new country and in a new league. He was aggressive, picking up a yellow card, and he looked brilliant on the ball. It seemed as though Manchester City had bought a man who would lead the line for Brazil for the next 10 years, and all for only £27 million. It must be said that Jesus has won 54 caps for Brazil, which is fairly remarkable at the age of only 24, and he has become quite a marvellous player. However, he is not a bona fide world-class centre-forward who Manchester City can hang their hat on to score 30 or even 20 goals a season. Jesus scored 14 times in 42 games last season, and after Sergio Aguero departed, City went hell for leather trying to sign Harry Kane. This season, he has struck 6 times in 25 games, though he has only managed 2 goals in the Premier League, and Pep Guardiola regularly starts someone else through the middle, despite Jesus being the most obvious, if not the only recognised senior centre-forward at the Etihad. I think Pep Guardiola is a magnificent coach, almost certainly the best in the world, and I think his record of player development is outstanding, but Jesus does seem to be just one player, whether that is his fault or not, who I think he has failed to get the best out of. Jesus is still a very talented player, and some will argue that his best position is out wide regardless. But I can't help but think of that 19-year-old Jesus in 2017 who looked to have it all, his goal-scoring potential, and the team that he is in, and wind up thinking that he ought to be challenging for the Premier League Golden Boot, not stuck on fewer goals this season than Jan Bednarak and Aymeric Laporte. 6th, Iñaki Williams. Athletic Club have one of the finest cantera systems in all of Spanish football, but I still feel as though 1 or 2 of their academy graduates, such as Iker Muniain and Iñaki Williams, could have become even better. Williams, it must be said, is still only actually 27, though he may feel the burden of having to act more mature with his 19-year-old brother Nico now also competing in Athletic Club's first-team squad. Of course, it is not unheard of for players to enjoy their most prolific goal-scoring campaigns after the age of 27, but nor is it particularly common for them to change their game all that radically. Williams has played more than 300 games in the Athletic Club first team since making his debut more than 7 years ago, and during that time, he has averaged slightly more than 1 goal every 5 games. That isn't a disastrous record, but given his talent and the opportunities that he often gets, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that he could have pushed on and started troubling the La Liga scoring charts in the same way that someone like Mikel Oyarzabal has been able to do in recent years. A really versatile and well-rounded footballer who almost never gets injured, Williams has played an incredible amount of football over the last 5 or 6 years. Capable of playing anywhere within a forward line, it's through the middle that the Spanish international has tended to operate this season, though he has only managed 5 goals in 26 games. We have seen in the past, most notably in the 2018-19 season, that Williams does have an eye for goal and is capable of scoring a lot of goals, but whether he will ever do so on a basis as consistent as the rest of his game remains to be seen. 5th, the entire Brighton and Hove Albion team. No, not really. That would be a bit of a cop-out, wouldn't it? But in this modern era of numbers and stats in football, rather than just pies and pints, it is possible to see which players statistically perhaps ought to have scored more goals, based upon their XG in comparison to their actual number of goals scored. In the Premier League, for example, Harry Kane has the biggest deficit between his XG and goals scored, and in Ligue 1, would you believe it, it is actually Lionel Messi, a man who for almost 15 years has outperformed his XG more than any other player in world football. It should be said that I haven't included players like Kane, Messi, Sancho and Lukaku, who probably should have scored more goals this season, but typically score lots because I wanted the 7 to be a bit broader than this season alone. Back to XG though, and in terms of teams, Brighton and Hove Albion have long been the Premier League's XG champions, at least since Graham Potter arrived at the club, and I'm going to include 2 Brighton players jointly in 5th, namely Neal Maupay and Adam Lallana. Lallana is someone who I've always thought very highly of, ever since his days ripping it up in League 1, and without injuries, I suspect he would have played a considerable part for Liverpool under Jurgen Klopp. Lallana is brilliant on the ball, really intelligent, and he routinely finds himself in promising positions. The problem, however, is his powder puff shooting. Honestly, the man just does not generate any power with the vast majority of his shots, and unless you have laser-like accuracy in terms of finding the corners, that is always going to hurt you. As a result, I think Lallana has lacked confidence in front of goal for the last 4 or 5 years, having scored just 2 goals in 102 games since the start of the 2017-18 season. That is an absolutely dreadful record for a player that I like a lot, and it means that he had to feature, even if only as a joint inclusion. Neal Maupay is also someone who I thought was extremely impressive for Brentford in the Championship, looking like a complete centre-forward, capable of contributing to multiple phases of play, bringing others into the game, and bagging a whopping 28 goals in his 2nd season with the club. In the Premier League though, Maupay has been wasteful at times, and much too inconsistent in front of goal. He has scored 25 goals in 90 games for Brighton in the Premier League, which isn't disgraceful, but as the talisman in a team that creates a hatful of chances in almost every game, and given the fact that I think he is actually quite good, it simply isn't enough. If he doesn't enjoy a strong second half to this season, I would expect Brighton to be on the lookout for an upgrade next summer. 4th, Nicola Sansone. German-born Italian international Nicola Sansone spent 9 years in the Bayern Munich academy before signing for his first Italian club, Parma, at the age of 19. Now aged 30, Sansone has since played for both Sassuolo and Villarreal prior to joining his current club Bologna in 2019. On Sansone's Wikipedia page, under the heading Style of Play, he is described as being a fast and agile forward with a slender physique and an eye for goal. Now, far be it from me to question whichever Wikipedia contributor typed out that particular sentence, Sansone's mum, but it often seems as though if Sansone does indeed have an eye for goal, then it may only be one eye and that the other eye is aiming somewhere towards the crowd. Throughout his entire career, despite being 30 years old and having played 369 games, most of them coming on the left side of a front three, Sansone has only scored 59 goals. Less than 1 goal every 6 games doesn't reek of dead-eyed forward, in my book at least, and that is despite Sansone excelling in a number of other areas. Quick, good on the ball, and intelligent in terms of his movement, Sansone always looks a threat. He just very rarely punishes the opposition, and he has yet to score in 17 outings so far this season at the time of recording. Sansone took to Instagram earlier this season to voice his displeasure at Serie A players being mandated to receive a COVID-19 vaccination. But whatever your views on that particular issue, there can be no doubt that Sansone could do with injecting a few goals into his game. Sadly for Sansone, I don't think that Pfizer or Moderna have even begun work on that vaccine just yet. Third, Kai Havertz. I've said this about a lot of players in this 7, if not every player in fact, and I think that's because I wouldn't have included them and I wouldn't feel as though they should score more goals if I didn't rate them, but Kai Havertz is another player who I have long admired. In light of that fact, and having said as much for quite a while on this channel, I received a lot of comments and messages from people during his first half season at Chelsea asking what I'd ever seen in him. I think that was probably a bit harsh, and Havertz certainly began to exert more influence upon games during the second half of the season at Stamford Bridge, in addition to obviously scoring one of the most important goals in the entire history of the club. That was one of only 9 goals that Havertz scored last season, only 4 of which came in the Premier League, but I still thought that it was a very solid second half of the season that gave the young German plenty to build upon. There can be no doubt, however, more than halfway through the current campaign, in which Havertz has scored just 5 goals in all competitions and only 2 in the Premier League, that his goal scoring output up to now has been underwhelming. In his last 2 seasons at Bayer Leverkusen, Havertz scored 38 goals, so it is evident that he knows exactly where the goal is. You could make the case that he has been shifted around a fair bit at Chelsea, but by the same token, he has also played as a false 9 at times, which theoretically ought to have resulted in him scoring more goals. I put him in my FPL team at the beginning of this season, so confident was I that he would get back among the goals. But as of yet, it just hasn't happened. I will take full blame for that. I'm awful at FPL. To be clear, I am still a fan, and I do still think that Havertz is a fabulous player. I just also think that he should be scoring a lot more goals. Second, Alexander Isak. Every time that I watch Alexander Isak, he leaves a real impression on me. His pace, movement, and 6'4" frame, combined with excellent technique, dribbling ability, and a sharp first touch. I'm often told by people who watch more Spanish football than I do that he can be inconsistent and only plays well in bursts, and I don't doubt that they are telling the truth. I just seem to always watch his good games. And yet, despite seemingly being close to the complete package in terms of a centre forward, Isak's goal scoring doesn't really reflect that fact. What's more, unlike with a lot of players who made my shortlist, and indeed my 7, whether that be Iñaki Williams or Adam Lallana, I don't actually think that he is particularly lacking when it comes to composure in front of goal. Often, I think his finishing is quite sharp, albeit I think he ought to be much more effective in the air, given his size. It should be said that Isak is far more prolific than most of the players that we have so far discussed, with 41 goals in 115 games since signing for Real Sociedad in 2019. That is a little better than a goal every 3 games, which certainly isn't bad going for a 22-year-old, and I wouldn't have included him if I wasn't convinced that he was capable of doing so much more. Isak has missed 4 or 5 games this season through injury, but worryingly, he's also on course for his worst goal-scoring campaign in San Sebastian as things stand. Off the back of 17 goals last season, all of which came in the league, Isak has only managed 8 so far this term, only 4 of which have been scored in La Liga. It is a slightly disappointing tally for a man who, based upon his ability, and if he were just a little bit more prolific, would most likely be getting linked with some of the biggest teams in Europe. Honourable mentions. Long-term subscribers may recall that I used to format all of my videos like this, with the honourable mentions featuring between first and second place, but for some reason that I can't recall, I stopped. Anyhow, I have brought it back today because I'm mad like that, and because there are a great number of honourable mentions that I'm going to attempt to rattle through as quickly as possible. Players who made my shortlist but not quite my final 7 include the likes of Ferran Torres, Haris Seferovic, Anthony Martial, Joao Felix, Roberto Firmino, Daniel Podence, Alan Saint-Maximin, Otar Kichveli, Callum Hudson-Odoi, Manu Garcia, Corey Smith, Timo Werner, Pione Sisto, Adama Traore, and Richarlison, among many, many others. And I stress the two manys in there, since I could have made a list of 50 and I would still have had honourable mentions. Also, and this might seem like a rogue shout to some people, but I had Kurt Zouma among my list of candidates. Obviously, Zouma is a centre-back, but if you watch him closely, you'll see that he has one of the most impressive leaps and an absolute bullet of a header within his own box. If he can sharpen up on his accuracy, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't be hitting 5 or 6 goals a season up from the back, at the opposite end of the pitch, just like John Terry and Nemanja Vidic did at their very best. Right, those are the honourable mentions, but here is your top spot. First, Alvaro Morata. I think it's fairly subjective to say that a player should score more goals, even if you try to use a more tangible metric like XG versus goals scored, except for in the case of Alvaro Morata, where it is a scientific fact that he really should score quite a lot more goals than he actually does. Morata is a really well-sculpted centre-forward. He's 6'3" tall, his movement is great, he can head a ball, he's quick, and he can finish, particularly on his right foot, but his left isn't too bad either. If you had designed Morata in a lab to go out into the big wild world and become a world-class striker, you would be pretty content with the job that you had done. Somewhere along the manufacturing process, though, a certain ingredient or chemical balance was lacking. A healthy dose of composure, a sprinkling of self-belief, and a splash of bottle. Add those to the mix, and you probably have a player who would be in Ballon d'Or contention. The reality, however, is a man who has seemingly convinced several clubs to pay more than £50 million for him without ever actually delivering when it matters most in a manner befitting of a £50 million centre-forward. As with Isak, Morata has scored goals, 28 in 73, since joining Juventus a year and a half ago to be exact, but is that enough? It is 1 goal every 2.6 games pretty much, and I would suggest that in a team who were Scudetto winners when he arrived, it's just a little bit underwhelming, just as he was at Chelsea, and indeed for Atletico Madrid, on most of the occasions in which I saw him. Again, it is not that Morata, or anyone in this 7, is a bad player. I am not saying that. It is precisely because they are very good that they ought to score more goals, along with the teams that they are playing in and the number of chances that they squander. On all of those grounds, Morata seems like a fitting top spot as far as I'm concerned. That is it for today's video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. Hit the like button if that was the case, and make sure that you are subscribed, of course, and have notifications turned on for the finest YouTube channel in all the world. No, not that one. I'm on about HITC Sevens, this one. So yeah. You can also find me on social media, on Twitter or Instagram, via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.